So today on the Life Itself Second Renaissance podcast, I'm excited to welcome Robin Hanson. He is an economist, a futurist, and a thinker known for his provocative work across a range of areas, the prediction markets, signaling, and the long arc of civilization. And recently, perhaps not so recently, he's become very interested in cultural evolution, which is close to our heart here on the podcast. He is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University, and until 2024 was a research associate at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. He holds a PhD in social science from Caltech with earlier degrees in physics and philosophy. And over the decades, he's published widely on topics ranging from hidden motives and cultural evolution, e.g. the elephant in the brain, to speculative futures of emulated minds, the age of M. And through his blog, Overcoming Bias, which is now on Substack, he has pioneered many topics and been an informal founder of the rationalist community. So a big welcome, Robin.
Howdy, welcome.
Yeah.
So I guess the word that stood out from your description was provocative. I might have aspired to be insightful.
Yes.
And there's an interesting relationship with whether you'd call me insightful or provocative. I guess provocative suggests some color to my topics that are different from other people's topics. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just finding an interesting description.
Right, exactly. But I think at the very heart of what I've known of your work, of this kind of the free thinker in the true sense of it, that we need to question the elephant in the mind, the things that hide our own biases and so on. I mean, now I wanted to ask you actually right at the beginning, which is we often start with people's origin story. You know, how have you ended up on this path? Like you, in a way, it has been. It's both kind of unusual, at least within the profession. You've done a whole variety of things. Tell me a little bit how it began. Were you always asking questions? Were you always curious, or as you are today, or was it? Yeah. How do you?
We're kind of vague here in the sense that we're not saying what it is I am that I've become. Yeah. So obviously I've done many different things and they've influenced many different dimensions of me, but now we're asking, well, which are the important dimensions to focus on to find the, origin causes? So I guess, for example, as an undergraduate at UC Irvine in physics, I took more control of my teaching and education. And the first 2 years, you go through basically 6 different topics. And then the last 2 years, you go through the same topics with more math. And I was unhappy with that because I wanted to understand the concepts. And so I took this deviant approach, which I didn't think that much about and didn't, consult people about. I just decided I would stop doing the homework, which took a lot of time, and I would just play with the equations to try to understand them. And that meant I could ace the exams, but I got zeros on the homework. But that was a choice to take control of my intellectual journey, to decide for myself what were the interesting things to pursue. I had even before then done my own projects on the side and, took that control of my intellectual life to think through and try to pursue things that weren't assigned in classes or, things that would get me credit. An earlier formative event was that sometime in, I think, junior high school, an English teacher of mine, a teacher of language, English, saw that I just wasn't working very well in his class. It wasn't working for me, he thought. So he assigned me instead for the hours period of English class to simply go to the library, sit in a room and write for the hour and show me whatever I'd written. And he and I both thought that worked better. I learned to write better by just writing, and that would be the whole time I would spend in English class is simply writing, sitting in the library. But it's another example of sort of taking my control of my intellectual journey, doing it myself, and then, rather than doing what I'm told or following what the lead of other people. So I am apparently more of an autodidact. Over time, I have taken more control of my research and my thinking. And I'm still surprised when I meet so many people who say that they'd like to learn more, but they don't have time to go to classes. And I say, well, you don't need to go to class to learn. Because that seems more obvious to me. You should just be able to, if you want to learn something, find the right textbooks or sources or YouTube videos now and just learn it. So I guess that was my initial habits compared to other people were more to just think for myself what were the important topics and then try to pursue them as best I could, whatever sources and supports I had, but I didn't necessarily need supports. And then later on, I sort of, I guess I need degrees I will have to find matching programs with my topics. And then, I went more and more along the way to sort of cut my own path, I guess, in terms of topics and what I was doing. So most academics, last thing to say is, if you ask them, why are you doing what you're doing? What's the point of your topic? They just don't have much to say. They haven't
Yes.
actually thought through why anyone would want to research that, why it would be important to the world. And that's because
Yes.
most academics, even intellectuals, are being carried forward by momentum of the community they're in, the institutions they're in. Even if they're a journalist, say they're following public opinion and what the conversation's on, or an
Yes.
academic, they are following the literature. And that's usually seen as sufficient motivation to them for sufficient rationale. And I've always instead been saying, well, what is fundamentally important? What's neglected that's important? And then can I find an angle on any of those things? And if that triple is my magic combination for what I try to work on. And I think it's not that hard to figure out what's important. It's not like
Yes.
some subtle calculation. The basic things that are important in the world are kind of obvious once you know the basics of the world. And then what's neglected isn't that hard to tell because you just compare what's important to what's being done. And whatever is important that's not being done, well, that's neglected. And then the harder part, I guess, is to find an angle, to find some way to make progress. Because sometimes things are important neglected because people just can't figure out what to do.
Yes. Right. The Riemann conjecture, So what I want to go back because on your bio page on your site, you say, I have always asked questions, even when I was very young. What kind of age were you asking these kind of
This
questions?
is like 4 years old or 4 or 5 years old.
You had this curiosity, right? This sense of, and did you notice that was different? When did you become aware that not everyone, like
I
you
mean,
just that
but
that wasn't white?
this was an anecdote that my mother
Oh,
gave because she thought it was
yes.
strikingly different about me compared to other people. So I would ask,
Yeah.
more of those questions. I,
I feel that because I remember having this. I remember being a young kid and my mother still telling me today that the level of why questions I was asking were, maybe on the edge of annoying, and would vary. Why is the sky blue? But also why why are some people poor, or why do some people have no food and other people have food, or things like this that I would ask as a very young
uh,
kid.
so I found it like first one is how do snakes travel? What's
Yes.
inside my finger? How is bread made? What's the cat saying? They aren't especially insightful questions. They're just the
Yes.
obvious things around you and probing one level further.
So you always had this curiosity, that's what I'm hearing, and this kind of desire to get to the foundations of issues. So what you just
I mean, the
said,
foundation things would take time. That is, initially, there are no foundations. There's just a world around you, and you're trying to learn whatever you
yes,
can. But then eventually, once you realize that there are such things as foundations, well, those seem like especially effective ways to learn a lot all at once.
right.
If you can learn about foundations, then that tells you about all the things that are built on those foundations. And rather than going one by one through learning 1,000 trees, if you learn the essence of a tree, now you can know a lot more about all the trees you ever find. And you recurse with that, looking for more and more fundamental concepts that you could learn about.
And so to come back to your question you asked before, when were you first, like this question you said, what is important, what's neglected, and then what's an angle to do something about that? When did you start asking yourself that kind of question? And what answers did you start coming up with?
Well, I don't know when I first did it because it was probably just a slow accumulation of my sense of what was important. But then at some point, I might deviate from my educational training or whatever and deciding, well, the thing they're training me on doesn't look as important as these other things I could be studying instead. And then I would more start to deviate.
When did that happen? So when did you have these
I
moments?
certainly think it happened by the time of early college. So, for example, one simple project I had as an early physics student was just to make a graph of the universe in terms of size and mass on a log off graph. It turns out this big triangle of where everything is, there's three lines that bound it, and you can put things places on this graph. I mean, that just seemed to be an obvious way to ask the question, what is there? Nobody else apparently that I had found had done that. Since I've done that, I've learned that other people later had also done that. It's a sort of question that other people also ask. But basically, I remember, thinking that seems like an important question, even if it's not an assigned question to me, even if other people aren't talking about it. Why don't I go figure that out? So clearly, by that point, I had enough self confidence or autonomy to just take what seemed to be an obvious, simple question and then pursue it, even though there was no outside support for that. And I had an
So,
angle. So the angle is obvious for this. Just find things and plot them on the graph,
yes.
and
And this
find
is a
constraints and plot them on the graph. And there you are. Now you have the graph.
and you notice patterns in the graph. And so my question, maybe we'll jump straight to a particularly recent thing and then come back, is, in your recent, well, maybe it goes back a long way. You could tell me about that. But this aspect of both a concern about potential civilizational decline and the relation of, fragility and the aspect of cultural drift. Could you tell me a bit about that? Like, if you're explaining it to me like I didn't
Right.
already know about
Well,
it, or the
I
listeners,
mean,
yeah.
if the question is why is it important, it just seems obvious if you think, could civilizational collapse be important? Well, of course it's important, right? It's not like that should be at all controversial. I mean, as a side comment, I did some work on where are aliens in space time a while back. And, why does the universe look so empty? And it just seems obviously important. Of course it's important. The question is only, could you find something interesting to say about it? And the same for civilization collapse. I mean, obviously, civilization collapse is important. There's just no question about that. The only question is there anything I or you could
Yes.
learn about that would be different than what the usual conventional wisdom is on the topic? And that is surprising to me, to think that I could have something original, insightful to say on such an obviously topic of long noticed importance. It seems that I do.
So let's talk about it. So first of all, for listeners, so civilizational collapse, we're meaning that, if we look back, maybe the aspect is historic analogy. Many civilizations, like let's say the Romans, or
Pretty
we
much
could
all of them.
have
Pretty
have
much
gone through
all
some fairly
have collapsed.
catastrophic decline at some point, which, while there's sometimes debate, for example, about what happened in the late Roman Empire, there's now pretty solid evidence from the archaeological and other records of pretty serious reductions in, like, economic complexity, the level of trade, maybe even life expectancy, food quality, food diversity, and obviously mostly maybe for the elite, but also for the broader population. So what we're saying is that many, many civilizations, obviously almost everyone from the past, because otherwise they'd still be around running things,
Right.
has kind of collapsed or disappeared. And the famous question I always remember being asked when I was like, name the seventh most famous Mayan. And
Right.
and we can't. And if you think of your own civilization, and we see it vividly, in films, even in memory, the Planet of the Apes, we go into the future and, humanity has disappeared and the apes have taken back over or something like that. So this, and what you're saying is, it's obvious that that should be something of concern. If that's happened to previous civilizations, could it happen to ours? And what could we do about it? Because obviously a
Right.
catastrophic collapse in which like 80% of current human population died in bad ways, through famine or war,
Right.
would be terrible. But whether your stuff is original, just tell me through. So what is your thinking on it in that way?
So as long as we raise the question of the past track record, let's just
Yeah.
say I've been a futurist for a long time, hanging out with futurists, thinking about future technologies. And part of the excitement of being a futurist is projecting past trends. And there is this past trend that's very encouraging, which is that if you just took all of humanity over the last million years and you track the total impact and capacity of humanity over that period, it seems to be a relatively steady rise, exponential, that has two sharp breaks of rate, but still just overall pretty steady rise. Like the biggest documented fall might be 14% decline in the population in the Black Death or something, in 1300, which is a pretty modest decline. And so you see humanity continuing to rise. You go, wow, I guess I should predict it will continue to rise over that, very long period. Now, the data isn't so good for the, up to 10,000 years ago, say. So there could have been some large falls within that period. But more recently than that, the whole world seems to largely just be rising together. And so that's made me and other futurists optimistic that, okay, the future is great and we're going to keep rising. And then I neglected, I have to admit, this other trend that we were just talking about is the consistent rise and fall of civilization. So basically, pretty much all communities, civilizations, and cultures and worlds of interacting people in history have risen and fall. And that's not just the last 10. You can go back farther. It's much smaller ones before, they were also rising and falling. And that suggests that because now the whole world is an integrated culture, that where we're all interacting a lot with each other. And that if that's the unit of analysis that makes sense to think about these past things that rose and fell, well, then the trend says this one will fall. And then many futurists go, oh, gee, that's disturbing. But they often like to say, well, but things are just different today. And you can list 1,000 things we have today they didn't have in the past. But then the question is, yeah, but if you think about all the explanations people gave in the past for why civilizations have risen and fallen, most of those apply today. Mainly the only one that doesn't is external rivals, invading. That's not very likely
Yes.
to happen in the next few millennia here
Particularly
on
with the work
Earth.
on the Fermi paradox. Yeah.
Right,
I
exactly.
mean,
But so that's concerning. Like once you see that, you go, oh, that I should take that seriously. But still, it's hard to take it that seriously. It's abstract. So the new thing for me is to have a more concrete model of what's actually causing our rise and then fall. And
yes.
then with a more concrete model of that, then I'm more worried. And so we could walk through that more concrete story of what could be causing a fall. But already in the background, there's this general concern. Look at this track record.
Look at
They
this
all rose and
pattern.
fall.
Yes, there's look at this pattern. I think that's very good. I mean, by the way, just to say personally, this is a great conversation because one of the things I was also one of those people asking these questions, and I remember getting like Joseph Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies back in the late 90s or the 2000s when I was an undergraduate, and no one, ordered it online. It was out of print at that point. It was secondhand. And this was the kind of question I was asking, like, what is carrying capacity of Earth, or how have societies sustained themselves? So yeah, walk me through the kind of the concerning factors. I mean, so there's the
Right.
general.
I want to make an analogy with driving to humanity superpowers. So if you want to say in the quickest, most basic terms, what it is that makes humans different from all the other animals, what is our superpower? It isn't so much just that we have big brains. Many people like to think of that. It's that we have culture. Culture allows us to load software into these big brains and rapidly change that software. So, culture is literally the habits we inherit from other people about how to think and what to do. And that's pretty much all of what we think and do is habits we've inherited from other people. And so, culture is the fact that we can inherit these habits without going through our DNA. So, pretty much all the other animals out there, most of what they do is inherited from their DNA. They pass it on that way, but that's a very slow process for allowing changes and innovations to accumulate in their behavior. And we humans can change our behavior and accumulate it much faster and more effectively via culture, via the ability to share a behavior with each other. So that's humanity's superpower. It's really powerful. We've been doing great with it, but it is a control process. It's a process. It's a natural selection process, Darwinian. And mostly we think about a Darwinian process as the process that improves things. But actually, its first task is to prevent things from getting worse. And that's what it's actually doing most of the time. And so that's like a control process, like a driving process. So I'm going to make the analogy to driving a car. If you've got a car going down the road, there's a set of parameters of this process such that if the parameters are in the good regime, this will go fine. But if they're in the bad regime, it'll go badly. So what parameters are we talking about? Well, how clearly can you see the road ahead? How fast is your car going? How fast does the road wiggle? How fast of a reaction do you have between what you see and what you think to do, and how much fast you turn the wheel? How reliable is the connection between the wheel and the tires? How bumpy is the road? You can see that if these parameters go bad, you won't stay on the road. You will drive off the road. But if the parameters are good, you will be able to follow the road. So, this process that humanity has to protect ourselves, preserve ourselves, and improve ourselves is cultural evolution, and it has some parameters. And for most of human history, those parameters were in good regimes. It was working. And my suggestion is that at the moment, they aren't. We moved these parameters into bad regimes where we're going to drive off the road. So, to explain that, I have to explain what these parameters are and how they've changed. So, the key first thing to understand is there are two levels, at least, that selection can happen, that natural selection happen. And so, with biology, an analogy is species. So, there is evolution within a species where different members of the species acquire different mutations, and then that spreads through the species. But it's hard to spread across a species boundary. So innovations within a species do better with bigger species. The bigger the species, the more different parts of it can invent things, and then they all share them and spread through the whole species. Bigger species can evolve faster. But then there are features of species that all the members of a species have to have in common, and those can't really be evolved by individual members in the species being different. For that, the whole species has to evolve. And so you need different species that are trying different things, and some win and some lose, and then they have descendant species. And that's a higher level evolution process for species. And it turns out that higher level actually seems to matter more. So in the world over the last billions of years, we've had some places where there are integrated ecosystems, like big parts of the ocean. And in that, you have a large region that's pretty much the same. And then you have a few big species. And then we have other places in the world where we have lots of little fragmented habitats like rainforests and coral reefs and rivers. And in those places, because the ecosystem is so fragmented into lots of little places, you have lots of little species. And so in those places, there's less innovation within the species, but more innovation of the species. And it turns out that most life today came from that fragmented spot. They came from the places where they had lots of little species, because that was apparently more important for producing the innovations that have led to life today. So
Yeah,
that's an analogy for culture.
and it would be a classic version of the what is it, the fundamental theorem of genetics, or whatever, that you want more variance. But in a way, variant species give you more variance in
Right.
features than within a species.
They let biology vary the features that can't change within a species. And there are a lot of those, and they're important. And that's the thing. So the same thing holds for culture. Humans have cultural evolution, and we have cultures, and then there are things that can vary within the culture, but there are other things that can't vary easily within the culture, and so we need different cultures to have evolution of those things. So, for example, think about status markers like education in our society. Individuals can decide to get more or less education, and they could even decide to respect the people around them more or less because of their education. But there's this general respect for education. And if you don't pay attention to that, you will lose out in competition with other people in your culture because the culture respects education. So if we're going to change how much education is respected, we need different cultures
Right.
that respect them to different degrees and see how they compete with each other. You, as a person in your culture, can't do that much to defy the culture's respect for education. You can just get less education, then you'll be thought less of, and you'll have to suffer those consequences. So that shows there are levels of culture, there are the units of culture, and there are within culture. And a nice data set on this is corporate cultures. So basically, most corporations have a culture, and that makes things hard to change in that culture. Some cultures like to document everything. Some cultures are very risk averse. Some cultures are very attentive to customers. And the point is, if you're a member of a corporation that needs to document everything, and you decide not to document stuff, that just won't go so well for you. Okay.
Yes.
You'll need to follow your corporation's culture about documenting things. But different corporations that vary in their emphasis on documentation will then compete with each other. And we have these two levels of competition of corporations. One is within a corporation, different people compete to try different things and rise and succeed. And the larger a company, the more that an innovation found in one part of the company can spread to all the rest of the parts of the company. So again, like with biology, larger firms can better promote innovation inside the firm and spread it all around. But larger firms have less innovation of the features that the corporation shares across the whole company. And in fact, industries with more fragmented firms are more innovative. So just like with biology and the species, in the economy, for industries with more small firms, even though they can't spread innovations within the firms as well, they have more innovation of the features that firms have to share within the firm. And again, the importance of that higher level of cultural evolution for firms and businesses. So now we come to the topic that's the important one here for our focus is macrocultures. So we share these larger cultures, not just a corporate culture that works away inside one firm, but we share these larger societies that have more basic cultural elements we share. These are attitudes to, say, democracy, governance, law, family, child
Yeah.
rearing, death, patriotism, arts, creativity. We have cultures at larger levels that share attitudes about those things. And it's hard for you as an individual to deviate from those effectively. That is, just like with the value of education, you're going to go along with your culture's priorities on such things because that's what will reward you the most. But then your culture as a whole might either be good or bad at that. And then it'll have to be cultural evolution of cultures as a whole that decides how those things should go. So that's the setup of there's cultural evolution of humans, and it has key parameters of this process at both levels, but it's this larger level that we want to focus
Right.
on.
So the key point, just to recap, is that we can think that to step back, basically one point is that in an evolutionary theory in general, the rate of evolution of a group, a kind of fitness, proceeds with the amount of variation. So in a larger group, if the species is bigger, there's more variation because there's more people. So the idea is you kind of think of it, there's random chances for biology to come up with some new thing, a longer beak, a better way of flying within this larger group of all these, let's say a very large group of pigeons. Great. The issue is that if we think of it at species level, where all the pigeons, what they share in common is they are all birds. They're not going to suddenly become a lizard. If we want this competition between different groups, if you like, or different species, we want more species. More species, by analogy, also gives us more innovation. And so coming to the fact of culture, the analogy is there's all French people or something like that who, yes, there's a lot of variation within French people, but there's a common culture. They all speak French. And similarly, there's all these English. But then what we actually like is, let's say we're talking just here of like language innovation. Yes, there's innovation within English with a big pool of English people, but we want a lot of different languages to find a really great language, to come along.
Right.
Okay. And so the issue is if I'm just guessing a little bit ahead is, therefore, if the pool of species, metaphorically, these macro cultures is reducing, that reduces the level of cultural
Right.
innovation.
Yes, that's true, but that's only one of four parameters. So you
Got
should
you.
be even more parameters. So let's go to 3 centuries ago and summarize the situation then, and then compare what happened over the last 3 centuries. So
Yes.
3 centuries ago, most of the world was focused on little peasant cultures of maybe 1,000 or so people. Those peasant cultures were very local, just a group of people near each other, and they were pretty self-sufficient. They made their own stuff, their own food, their own buildings, and they lived their own little life as a small culture of 1,000 or so people. And that was the world of 100,000 such cultures. Now, yes, there were empires above them and they had to pay taxes and send their sons to war or whatever, but those empires didn't really care about the local culture. As long as you paid your taxes and sent your sons to war, they would let you do your local stuff however you wanted.
Yeah.
And so there were just lots of little cultures. Now, these little cultures were near the edge of subsistence. They were poor. So they often suffered famines and war and pandemics, and that could really test them. And if a local culture somehow went bad, it just wasn't able to function very well, its people would be absorbed by neighboring cultures and it would go away. So there was strong selection pressures of these small peasant cultures because they were near the edge of survival and they faced many harsh, obstacles. There were 100,000 of them. That's two parameters now, but there's two more. Another parameter is how fast was the world changing that they needed to adapt to? And up until 3 centuries ago, it was pretty slow. So as the world slowly changed, new technology showed up, say the potato from the New World or the tomato, then they would slowly change their habits of farming and diet and what they would store and what crops they would focus on, but they could do that slowly because the world was changing slowly. So I mean, another function of culture is not just to prevent it from going bad, but that's the most important thing. It's also to slowly adapt to changing conditions. So if the conditions are changing slowly, that makes it easier to keep track and
Yeah.
have the culture change along slowly. Parameter number 3, how fast is the world changing? Parameter number 4 is how much does the culture just change internally, ignoring all the rest of the stuff? And up until a few centuries ago, the world was very conservative about that. Most cultures were trying not to change very much. They were not eager for change. They were suspicious of change and they resisted many perturbations that would tempt them or try to push them to change their culture. And so they had a momentum to their culture, i.e., slow, resisting change. So those are the four parameters: variety, how many cultures, there are hundreds of thousands; selection pressures, how rapidly, if your culture went bad, would you just be dropped out of the pool and replaced by others? The environment changing rate, how fast is this thing you're trying to track with your culture changing? And fourth, how much internal change is there that just moves your culture around, independent of all the rest? Okay, that was 3 centuries ago. Now let's move forward and say what happened over those 3 centuries. So for the first parameter, variety, the first thing that happened is we merged peasants into nations. Famous book, Peasants into Frenchmen, describes this in France. It's very good. And basically, nations used force and harsh measures to really crush peasant cultures and make them have a common national culture, forcing them via school and other things to have a common language, common measures, common laws, and then much lower scales of trade. They created national cultures out of peasant cultures. And that happened all around the world, a bit later after France, elsewhere, but that was a worldwide trend. And so by the middle of the 20th century, much of the world had turned peasants into nationalists. And so we moved from hundreds of thousands of cultures down to a few hundred cultures at that point. But then in the last century, we've gone farther, especially among elites. We have created more of a global monoculture wherein people from all around the world mix up among elite institutions and have shared culture. So many elites around the world go to the same schools, the same elite schools. They work and talk in the same NGOs and organizations. And I've met many of these people, and of course, they're all sharp and eager to work with each other and help. And they'll all tell me the following two things, in essence. If they're from a particular place, like say Brazil or France, if you talk about, what are Brazilians like or French people like, they will tell you that the people they come from are different, and they have differences that the world should recognize and value. They are willing to embrace and say, my place's differences are good. But they'll also show you and imply that they personally are not very different. They will function just fine in any international organization or conference or whatever you've got. They are just generic global elites,
Right.
and they don't really have much difference that originates from the place they came from. That is, we've created this world culture. And if you look and say the COVID policy and many other regulatory policies, you see how there's just strong convergence of policies all around the world, even though they come from different places, because most of these regulatory policies are set by elites who mix a lot all around the world. So we have a greatly reduced variety of cultures. It's hard. People mistake this by saying, oh, but look, there's all these different foods and clothes and songs and holidays and, decorating styles and, buildings. But that's shallow culture. People like what they call multiculturalism, mostly for shallow variety of that sort. But if you think about deep variety of the things we talked about, attitudes toward war, democracy, or gender equality, or spanking children, those sorts
Yeah.
of things, people hate variety of that. They don't want that variety, and they try to repress it as much as they can. So on deep value things, the world is quite convergent. And probably, you know, the most dramatic example to think about is fertility convergence. Whole world is falling in fertility together, even though the issues of fertility vary a bit across the world. But strikingly, the whole world, when you look at sort of levels of wealth, there's just a very consistent fall in fertility across the whole world on something you might have thought would be more dependent on local cultural differences. So that's the variety parameter, way down. Second is the selection pressures. So we've gotten rich in the last few centuries. And that means we're just not killing off groups of people with pandemics and wars and poverty anymore. They are just all surviving. So selection pressures are just way down. Certainly, this global monoculture we have is not at all threatened by any imminent, disasters that'll knock it flat. So selection pressures are down. Probably the main selection pressure is maybe long-term implications for fertility, but that will take a long time to play out. The third parameter is rates of change. So up until a few centuries ago, the world economy doubled roughly every 1,000 years. And then the world population doubled roughly every 1,000 years. And that happened for 10,000 years. So that was a pretty slow rate of change for peasant cultures to adapt to. And they adapted just fine. Over 1,000 years, they could. The timescale of doubling the world economy is roughly the timescale in which lots of things change. And this for company, a company, once it world. And today, the world economy doubles every 15 to 20 years. And that's today the timescale in which major business practices and institutional features, et cetera, of the world change on the timescale at which the world economy doubles. But now that's much faster. So the target that cultural evolution needs to track is changing much faster, roughly every 15 to 20 years. And that means cultural evolution has a harder problem. It needs to search in the space and variations of its culture to find something that works better for the new world every 20 years. That's the third parameter. And now the fourth parameter is how much the culture just changes internally, ignoring all the rest of these things because it just wants to change. Up until 3 centuries ago, it didn't want to change. Cultures tried not to change. But the rise of modernism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was a dramatic switch where culture decided it wanted to change. And it did change a lot. And since then, we've had rapid, huge cultural changes in many basic values and many basic norms, changing attitudes toward war, democracy, gender, homosexuality, now trans, attitudes toward education, attitude toward government, toward family, toward death, toward community. Those attitudes have been changing rapidly and not primarily by adapting to changing conditions. It seems like the actual underlying process driving this is the rise of youth cultures because of the rise of school. So, in the very end of the 1800s, we had the rise of high school, and high school kids are old enough because they would be adults in previous eras that they, when they got together and just interacted strongly with each other, would form their own culture. And then that culture changed, was the origin of a lot of cultural changes. That is, high school students and then college students would get into their heads that they wanted some key cultural change, and they would then coordinate to push for it. And they consistently win those battles, quite consistently for the last century or so. We have large changes in cultures that originate in youth movements, that germinate in schools, and our culture changes drastically over and over again as a result.
And if I could just recreate this for listeners, the issue with that is the way to think of it is, for me, is around a fitness landscape that I think we need to kind of make that clear when we say what cultural evolution is adapting for or is better implicitly in the discussion has been, as in evolution, better means fitter, which means more offspring.
Right,
So it's like you're the culture. So fitter does mean more successful and generally meaning like more energy capture, being able to
right. Yeah.
control more resources or have more children or whatever. Now, we just want to leave at the moment just to park it for this. So for listeners who might be sensitive, I don't think either that Robin is suggesting or I am that better in this sense means morally better or not. We're not, but we mean better in the
Right.
sense more successful.
Let's
The
talk
more
about that more because that's
yeah,
really
yeah,
important to get clear
yeah,
here.
yeah,
So, the superpower of humanity is a process of natural selection. Natural selection selects for some sort of fitness or
yes,
adaptiveness feature. And that process is the source of all the values you have. That is, all the things you think you value were created by that process. Natural selection chose to embody in you, in your DNA, values you have, and in your culture, the values you have. All of your values and norms are the result of this natural selection process. And they will continue to change in the future according to the same process. But you at any one moment have the values you have, and they may not
yes.
be the maximally adaptive values. And then from your point of view, you don't necessarily want things to get more adaptive because that might mean that the values go away from the values you have. So that's a fundamental conflict we as humans have. The more we identify with the values we were given from our culture when we were young, and the more we want to hold on to those values when we're older, the more we might be in conflict with not just only the next generations who show up with different values than you, but also this whole process that's going to keep moving it all away from you.
Right. Well, I'm also, and I'm also just trying to emphasize that, species that are more, thinking of it even in biological terms, species which are fitter and therefore more reproduce more and take over aren't necessarily better. They're better in evolutionary terms. They may even take
Right.
over an ecosystem, but they're not better in some moral sense. And just I'm saying this something that we can get.
Right. Absolutely. And we want to be clear about that.
And we also want to be clear that I just want to make one other comment. What you said is that, of course, the famous point about spandrels. We can have natural or cultural evolution throw up values or attitudes that may not maybe somewhat unrelated to fitness. In the long run, there will be a
Right.
tendency to select for things that are fitness. But it's interesting to remark, and I want to make one comment, here. Maybe I'm taking this from the side, but I just want to kind of. I think both of us have read Peter Turchin and things like that, or Joe Henrich. I think the thing that would be interesting is also to point out that, for example, just drawing here on Turchin's book on an ultra society, if we went back 20,000 years, in most gatherer-hunter societies, what we know today, and it's still imperfect, our knowledge of those periods, because we only know either contemporary gatherer-hunters in the last 200 years when we documented them that were going out, or we have archaeological evidence. But our general sense is they were quite highly egalitarian. And this is a feature that, in fact, still influences human nature in a big way today. We know when we play the dictator game or other economic games, how fairly, oriented towards fairness we are. The point, though, is that there was also an evolution where there was a big change, as we know when we watch movies about, the ancient Egyptians or Romans, that there was actually a move to highly inegalitarian societies, and also valuing things that valued domination, much more like being a warrior or being the god king or
Right.
whatever it was. Or we can read the Old Testament for that matter, or things like that. So what I'm pointing out here is that what could be fitter at one point. So if you're in a gather hunter gang, an orientation to egalitarianism might be both successful for your band, and doesn't mean it goes away totally. Of course, egalitarianism still matters, but there could become a point where being much more hierarchically attuned, because of the way society or technology has moved, and that farming has evolved and there's now surplus that can be appropriated, and all these things have shifted the fitness landscape. So I just want to emphasize again to listeners and to myself that fitness is meaning more adapted to the given fitness landscape. And I want that, therefore, to come back to the last point you were making to really understand it, which is, why does a lot of movement, like this youth culture and a lot of shifting, is that if I'm trying to climb up a hill, which is our fitness landscape, if that hill keeps having earthquakes, which is metaphorically the world changing a lot, or I'm driving my road and the road keeps changing very fast, or I'm changing things a lot internally. Why is that? I guess I'm trying to explain to you why that's a problem if there's a lot of internal shifting in the culture versus being conservative. Yeah.
So let's take the driving down the road example.
Yeah.
Um, if you just go straight and don't turn the wheel on a road that turns, you're in trouble.
Right.
So you should be turning the wheel, but it's important that your wheel turns correspond to the road turns. If you just randomly turn the wheel, independent of where the road's going, that's worse than just going straight.
Right.
It's important that the process that drives the turns of the wheel be connected to the road ahead.
Right.
So in cultural terms, merely wanting to change culture because the times are changing is not enough. You need a process whereby, seeing that the times are changing, you guess which changes would be more adaptive, and then you push for those changes. That would be a way in which we could perhaps speed up cultural evolution and make it work better if we could use our minds and clever insight
Right.
to make that connection. But if we just change culture for other random reasons that don't have much to do with what's becoming more adaptive, that makes things worse.
I guess my question then to you is that what you could feel, well, sorry, you just quite like the Bob Dylan line, like the times they are changing, and that aspect of youth culture. But I also question, one driver, and I don't know if this is the case, certainly in more recent times, of this kind of unification of culture, has been awareness that we suddenly have confronted problems that are of a more planetary scale. So we have this kind of dilemma. We want cultural diversity, but we also, traditionally, the reason we even had the growth of peasants into nation states was because of intergroup competition driving greater cooperation. And we now face issues, be it like environmental issues, which are global, or like technology governance issues, like dealing with nuclear weapons or dealing with AI, that sort of require global cooperation, which is often underpinned by a shared culture. So there seems to be this.
Right.
Do you know what I'm getting at? Is there a kind of dilemma that the
So
reason the '60s people were going with the times are changing, we need to be more for peace, is because we want to stop war because war is so dangerous now. There's the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. We could blow ourselves up. We need to come together. So there seems to be this kind of tension. If we don't come together, we might all kill ourselves. And if we come together, we're stopping cultural evolution.
So we're queuing up a number of topics here that I just want to go through methodically.
Yeah.
So just one very minor point to make is that when we're talking about fitness or adaptiveness, it's not, as it is in biology, so much just the number of children you have. You can have descendants culturally who are not your DNA children. It's about overall long-term influence and less about
Yes.
actual direct biological descendants. So cultural adaptiveness includes a larger ranges of ways that you could have descendants in the future. So that's just important to realize. It's not just about
Buddha has
DNA.
Buddha has a lot of cultural descendants, even if he has no children. I mean, he
Right,
has actually does have a child, but
right.
yeah. The
Now,
point being, yeah,
right. Now, secondly, there's two more topics to consider. One is what you're getting on is, could we move out of this dumb, blind natural selection process to more take control of the process or more help it along using our intelligence and our ability to get together as a world and discuss things and figure things out? And I want to set that topic off for a little ways until we really just understand the problem we're facing. And then there's this other question of, can we understand better how things are going wrong in terms of some of the features you've been talking about, in terms of like the change from foragers to farmers and attitudes of
yeah.
domination and things like that? Because I think we can actually understand some of those trends better than you might think. Um, so, but we want to finish the basic story is all four of these parameters have gone bad. What does that predict? Well, that predicts that. So the key thing is, up until a few hundred years ago, the world had, at great cost and great suffering for a million years, gone through this process of cultural evolution, slowly sorting out cultures that were more adaptive, at least in their environment, than the others. And that has been humanity's inheritance, a precious inheritance of cultures that worked. And then selection pressures and this process have weakened, and we had more random variation. And so the simplest prediction from that is we are drifting away from what worked to other random parts of the space. So the way I think you should want to, if you can think about this mathematically, abstractly, there's just a space of possible features of cultures, a high dimensional space. There's an adaptive region in that space somewhere, the precious region. It's a small part of the volume. There's a collection of points in this space, and some of the points are overlapping with that adaptive region. And the process is the points that are closer to the center of that region, they grow and they split, and the points away from it shrink and die. And this cloud of points needs to track this region as it moves. So the more points there are, the easier it can track the region. The stronger the selection pressure is, the easier it can track the region. If there are at least some points in the region, some of those grow, and there'll be a lot of them. And then slower this thing moves, the better. And all the less we have just random bouncing around of these points, independent of everything else, the better. Like random movement of the points is bad for tracking this process. A small amount of randomness is good, but too much is bad. So that's mathematically what we're trying to do.
Just make it, I think for myself and listeners again, it's imagine like just to make it concrete, like a very obvious maladaptive thing that does sometimes go on is like the whole world becomes a suicide cult. That would end humanity's
Right.
life. That would be a
Right.
maladaptive. And we know there are cultures that adopt that thing. Maybe they
Right.
decide
So,
that's the way to live
right.
forever or to join.
Attitudes towards suicide is one of the key parameters here. And clearly, you can be too repressive of suicide on one extreme, but you can be too inviting of it on the other extreme, and that could go really badly. So
Yeah.
that's one of the many hundreds of parameters of culture that matter, which is how supported the whole society is or not of suicide. Right. So the prediction then is, if you had something near the adaptive region, and then you turn off the selection pressure and you reduce variety, then the remaining points just drift away from the adaptive region. And that's going to be the problem. So things are going to just slowly break, slowly get worse. And then the prediction is we should look at things in our society and do we see some things slowly breaking or slowly getting worse? So that's one prediction of this, is that it doesn't predict which direction things get worse. It's just that stuff breaks and gets worse. So For example, we can go through the contributions to fertility and we can say they seem to be at roughly a half a dozen key cultural trends that are making fertility worse. And there's no particular reason necessary to expect them to have gone in any one direction, except they all seem to be, on average, making it worse. Oh, we
Right.
could go through that if you want, but that's one prediction here. But there's actually a different prediction, which is of a systematic trends. And we can actually get a systematic prediction out of this, which is the idea that we were once foragers, and foragers was the natural world we lived in. And then our minds and our habits were evolved to be foragers. And then when farming became possible, that was only possible because we had enough cultural plasticity to change to become farmers. And we spent 10,000 years as farmers, but still at some level, we're more naturally foragers. And it was selection pressures that held us away from the forager region into the farmer style. That is, humans have always, in some sense, been more naturally foragers, say more promiscuous, more egalitarian, more peaceful, more wanting to travel, art, things like that. That was more the forager style. And that's a more natural human style that humans naturally drift back to. And farming world has had to do work to hold us away from that. So whenever people drifted in that direction, to punish them and discipline them and hold them into being farmers, because that was the adaptive habit for 10,000 years. And then when we took away these pressures, we have been drifting back to be more forager like. That's a prediction of this model. And that gives you trends like more democracy, less religion, less fertility, less work, more travel, more leisure, more egalitarian attitudes in many ways, including democracy and
Yeah.
attitudes at work. All of those trends can be understood as a consequence of the relaxation of the selection pressures, and then we are drifting back to be more forager like. And another thing might be that humans are naturally selfish, present oriented, and myopic, or present oriented is the same as myopic, selfish and, well, so that
Short
we
term.
short termist, and then we care about ourselves, and then we're not paying attention to consequences to larger communities or the future. And culture always was necessary to pull us away from that. That is, humans always, even as foragers, you had to train people to be less selfish, to be less present oriented, because otherwise, and lazy, so that's the third one I'm looking for, because otherwise that's just the natural human state. Lazy, selfish, and myopic. And culture has always had to pull us away from that. But then when cultural selection pressures go away, we just drift back to being lazy, selfish, and myopic, because it's just the way our minds are easily made, is just to default to those things. And that would be another sort of trend prediction, is that over time we would go in those directions. So these are more concrete predictions of this analysis that you could then compare with what we see over the last few centuries in terms of how is culture changing.
Right. Right.
You were talking about the change of foragers to the domination
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Egypt, et
Yeah.
cetera. And this
And
helps us understand how that happened as a result of selection pressures. But now, taking away selection pressures, we have, in fact, drifted away from the Egyptian domination scenario, more toward the forager egalitarian scenario that is more our nature.
yes. And we can think of the question would be in these kind of theories would be how would we distinguish reversion from, let's say, a spiral model where we are in a, like a very simple two-dimensional thing. I come back to have certain features of a previous culture, but I've gone around a spiral. I actually have moved along. I'm not coming back to the same place. So, for
Right?
example, egalitarianism shows up in tech startups today because it's actually a highly efficient model. Or in the German Second World War, there was a sense actually that the Germans were quite innovative in the Second World War at the lower level of the army. They were quite egalitarian and allowed leadership to be quite fluid in their like
Right?
NCO below teams. But that wasn't an example of them necessarily going back to forager mentors. It was that it was actually adaptive to fighting efficiently and integrating. But I get this point. So what you're saying, there are predictions that there are certain defaults of human nature, that strong selection pressure goes on. I mean, the classic example is also, Dune. I don't know, many people listening. See, there's this culture of the Fremen, which is they've got this harsh environment that's going to then they need to be incredibly group oriented, incredibly willing to sacrifice for the group. That's very logical, but most of the time people they don't operate in that way. And so when we kind of take away those pressures to be highly cooperative, we may revert
Right?
to this model that includes both the positive, you might say, egalitarian, if we were adding the moral dimension in our own value system, or my own value system, but also the less valuable, like the lazy kind of, oh, I'm just going to do whatever I want. Looking at all of this, you were about to say there was something we're going to come to a little bit. You were saying of, well, are there ways, you know, we used to have it that life was kind of nasty, brutish, and short, and that's how we were. That was one of the pressures. Are there ways to get back on the road? What are there ways to, or kind of to
Right.
route that?
So if we're thinking we roughly understand the problem here, and now we're thinking about what can we do about it. Now, but a thing to notice is that part of the problem has been people claiming they're attempting to solving it. So if you look at these rapid changing youth movements, they are typically saying, I see a problem with the world and we're going to fix it with our youth movement, and this is the solution. So I mean, and that is roughly the structure of what you want, if only they would actually be identifying the actual problems and addressing them. Unfortunately, most youth movements are focused on some sort of moral sense and confidence that there's a certain moral change that should happen. And they're not thinking about how adaptive that is. They're just primarily thinking about that it feels compelling. And I think, again, that's often looking into your forager self inside you, or even your lazy self, and saying, it feels to me like I want to do this. You say we should do this other thing, but I don't know what, let's change that. So unfortunately, we will want to hold a higher standard. Yes, we will want some process perhaps by which we look at things and try to fix it, but it needs to be much better tied to adaptiveness. And unfortunately, since World War II, we've had this strong negative association with the phrase social Darwinism because we claim that Nazis were doing it. Now, the Nazis, I mean, Hitler didn't actually like Darwin all, and they didn't think humans were evolving. But you could still see them as, to some degree, trying to take up the cause of making Germans more adaptive. And that has tainted this whole idea of trying to
Yes.
think in terms of adaptiveness, which doesn't need to be through extermination, but you have to admit it could be. I mean, that is one of the things, the mechanisms on the table. If you're
Yes.
considering how to make some group more adaptive, war has been, in fact, one of the most powerful forces of cultural evolution for the last 10,000 years. So war, I guess, has to be on the table when you're thinking about this, but it's far from the only candidate strategy.
You're saying traditionally, war has been this great engine of this pressure, whether we like it or not. It's not that we're saying we want that, but the question is, we have to see that kind of there is a cultural selection aspect. So first of all, what do you think is? Can I ask a question? What do you think is fitness? How do we assess what fitness
Right.
is in that sense? Yes.
Okay, so first of all, fitness is this abstract concept. It's a foundational concept in our concept of natural selection. So it's a well founded, well understood concept, but it's hard to measure
Yes.
exactly in context. And so you actually just have to go through a lot of work to measure. But I do think, as a rough heuristic, low fertility is probably just pretty clearly low fitness. So I think I feel most confident that we should try to raise fertility, and that whatever is causing low fertility is most plausibly something causing low fitness. But then you get to other indications of fitness, clearly, like in addition to population, there'd be economic growth and capacity, there'd be cultural influence and cultural, compellingness and things like that. Those are all plausible indicators of cultural fitness, but weighing them against each other is hard and
Oh,
complicated, and clearly, but I think if we have a big enough problem, that makes the solution easier, in the sense that, like, when your house is burning down, you don't have to like do a lot of complicated reason deciding which rooms are worth more. You just put out the fire. So the worse the problem here is, the simpler the solutions can be. I wanted to make, I mean, once we're talking about values again, because I know this is a point that bothers many people rightly. If you have values, you say, look, I grew up in my culture and I value, for example, I value intellectual inquiry, open inquiry. It's just really important to me, but it's not obvious how culturally adaptive that is. So you might say, well, Robin, shouldn't you be willing to give up on your open inquiry in order to be more adaptive? And there's a sense in which I would, but I would turn it around this way. I'd say, look, whatever it is that you value, if you want it to be there in the future, not just today, if you want there to be future representatives who also hold that value and are promoted in the future, and if the world's going to continue to follow cultural evolution as its process, then you need to tie the things you value to things that are adaptive enough so that they will be there in the future. There is no other option. Cultural evolution only promotes and makes adaptive things exist in the future. So if you want anything to exist in the future, you will have to tie it to something adaptive. That allows you to value anything you like, but you realize maybe have a limited capacity for just how many things you can package. You've got a runner and you're going to put a backpack on him with these things you value. The more stuff you put in that backpack, the harder this runner is going to be able to win the race, right? So maybe you should, as Paul Graham says, keep your identity small, decide what are the few most important things that you really want to promote, and then find a way for those to go on with adaptive. So I like to think of this as an analogy to a ship heading to an iceberg. There's two strategies you have as a person on a ship heading to an iceberg. You either get the whole ship to turn or you get off on lifeboats. And that's our major choice ahead of us. So most of the things I value, I think, are tied with our shared world monoculture. World monoculture does value open inquiry to a substantial degree. And so the simplest way to save those things without necessarily listing them all out and trading them off against each other is just try to save our shared world culture from crashing. If you can save that, most of the things you and I value and all our listeners value will be carried along. But if that doesn't work, then you'll have to think about lifeboat cultures and
Yes.
somehow passing what you value on to some small culture now that might grow and save later because the big main one's not going to be there. So,
What do you think of the kind of things that are out? What are the kind of things? There's like you mentioned low fidelity. There's I guess risk from technology. Creating unleashing powers that we can no longer adequately control in some way, given the culture and governance and capacities that we have. I mean, what to kind of come to it? Well, I kind of got a couple of places I want to go. I mean, but one is that I'd like to ask, what are the kind of things that we need to like? What is the iceberg we might steer into? I mean, you mentioned low fertility. That's one. What are the things we need to shift? And I think the other thing I want to come to, and you might want to go to straight away, is talking about these four features. We could reinstitute, we could have less monoculture, we
right,
could have more war, but are there things
exactly.
that would be things that would lead to cultural selection pressures without necessarily violent war or
Right.
famine or
So
pestilence?
I was about to say there are these three levels at which we could change culture, and you just pointed to two of them.
Yeah.
So the most concrete level at which we could try to solve this problem is to try to identify specific cultural trends that seem maladaptive, and for each one, try to reverse them. So we could, for example, notice that we put too high a value on education, that's cutting into fertility. Let's cut back the value we put on education, say. As a concrete example, we could say mental illness is up and then figure out what's causing mental illness to go up and maybe get that decline. Why are drug deaths rising? Find whatever cultural trends seem to be causing that, produce that down. I might say if technology is being too slow because of too much regulation, we could try to find ways to streamline regulation. That's at the most concrete level. We could try to identify specific cultural trends that seem to be maladaptive and then try to create a consensus among elites to try to reverse them. That will require that elites come to value adaptiveness a lot. They'll have to put a high priority on adaptiveness, and they'll have to be pretty good at telling which things are actually adaptive versus not, which seems to be pretty hard because people really get emotionally tied to these cultural trends. That is, most of the trends say that are encouraging lower fertility are trends that people love. They have strong attachments to them. They have strong advocates for them. And so getting people to see that those are actually maladaptive is quite a challenge. And then if there are 20 or 100 of these trends,
That's
that's
a
a
lot.
big task to go one by one and try to make each one first help us understand and see that they're maladaptive, decide to reverse them, and then pay the costs of that. So, for example, I could tell you how we could reverse fertility. I have a concrete proposal for doing that, but it would in fact cause some pain for some people in some terms. But that's at this lower, more concrete level of addressing the problem.
Yes.
Now, there's an intermediate level you were pointing to, which is these four key parameters. And we could then focus our effort at that level of the parameters. We could ask, how could we change each of these parameters and try to solve the problem that way? So we want to get a elite consensus about the parameters being wrong, about wanting the parameters to go in a direction, and then about wanting to adopt things that can do that even if they are painful and costly in other ways. Right? But these are hard parameters to change. So look at variety. We like being part of a world that trades and talks and travels all over the world and has large degree of interconnection. And it's really hard to imagine breaking up that into substantially different subcultures without, in fact, while still allowing the high degree of talk and trade and travel that we enjoy. So we would have to push people to have more maybe insular communities where they don't leave them, and they are just very different, and they are suspicious of outsiders. And it's possible to imagine a world where we still have a large integrated economy, but we still are culturally isolated. But
It's
it's a big ask.
It's what I critique. There's this kind of interest in bioregionalism. I don't know if you heard of this kind of
Right.
concept recently of like, and I say, it's like they had this imagination that I've still got my iPhone shipped from around the world, but somehow
Right.
I'm in this little
I
bioregion
mean,
cultivating
there are
my vegetables.
ways to try to think that through, but it's a big ask. I think we just
It's
have
a
to
big,
see.
yeah,
Right. And,
possible. Yeah.
and it's really hard. The second one, selection pressures. I mean, yes, if we somehow invited more war and pestilence and poverty, we could end up with big chunks of people dying off and having selection pressures. But that's an even bigger ask. People are not very interested in inducing a world with large degrees of death and destruction. But that's one of the parameters. So if we go on to the next parameter, the rate of change, we could somehow slow down the rate of social change to doubling every 1,000 years instead of doubling every 20 years, like a factor of 60 or something. But that's a huge ask. People enjoy the growth of the economy and all the new things we achieve. And I don't think they're very eager at all to drastically slow down our rate of change in terms of the rate of, things we're needing to adapt to. So that's I mean, even if we wanted to, like, it's really hard to imagine how to enforce that. We need a
Yeah.
world government of some sort with strong regulatory powers to prevent innovation in all sorts of areas. And then the last trend is the youth movements. Somehow we could look, it is true. I think if you ask people, I did some surveys, these in the youth movement, do we think they actually know better than we older people? And most people know, no, we don't think those young people know better than we older people. But how come they keep winning? Well, because they coordinate better. Young people are more passionate, more willing to unify together, to agree with each other and to suppress their individual desires for the communal effort of their youth movement. They've been winning on that grounds, and somehow we would have to, as older people, decide to oppose youth movements more and to coordinate to say, no, we don't, just because you're young and passionate doesn't mean you know what you're doing. And we're going to say no more often. That's a really big ask because old people have already been not too happy with youth movements and they still let it happen. And somehow we would have to imagine being much better at that. Now, there's a fifth parameter that I haven't highlighted here, but we could focus on, which is if we think of this two-level split, things that cultures have to have in common versus things that you can vary within the culture. The problem is at that upper level. Well, we could try to take things out of that upper level and put them in at the lower level. That is, we could try to have features of our society no longer be set so much by a sort of implicit set of norms and values shared by a culture. That's another approach to solving this problem. And a concrete example of that is more capitalism. So, for example, one of the things we do through shared culture is governance mostly. That is, we have cultural attitudes toward governance, what we think are the proper forms of governments, what we think government should do, what it shouldn't do. And that's mostly being done through this shared norms level of culture. We are deciding as a culture whether we think homosexual marriage should be allowed, or other sorts of features of a shared culture. And then the government implements those things, and then we have choices of government structures. But we are mostly choosing and changing those structures and policies through our shared culture. And that's why those things are converging around the world as the world converges in its shared world elite monoculture. I know many of you will hate this, but I just need to say that it's an option. What if capitalists ran governments more? What if there was like cities owned by investors and they could choose all the policies for the city and they had shares in the city, and if the city grew, the shares made money. If the city shrank, the shares lost money. And then more of those policies would be determined by capitalist competition rather than shared cultural values. And that would be a way to introduce more of the lower level of culture variation. And you could even imagine for-profit orphanages, for example. One way to solve fertility is you let capitalists run orphanages, grow babies, and sell them. Why then? You know what? They're going to make a lot of babies. Capitalists would, in fact, make a lot of babies in for-profit orphanages. You might hate that process, but I'm just showing you the logic of
Yes.
it would change what level we make those decisions.
And there's a double point as well, which is that capitalism is as you mentioned earlier with firms, is a model of competition where there is generally not war. While
Right?
go dissolve, and that is painful when people lose their job. There is pains involved in company success and failure for our own lives. It's a model of diversity and competition that does not involve violence and warfare or pandemic. So, but I'm saying is that your point here, I mean, the question I've got for you is why you could also, you don't need to accomplish that through capitalism per se, in the sense there could be investors. One of the things that's gone on in the world is, in many, many states, you notice this incredible centralization, famous, in the EU, in the US, where more and more regulations become centralized. I mean, the classic thing, just a very concrete for listeners, would be educational curriculums. If you go back now,
right?
even 30 years, like in the UK where I grew up, most local councils got to vary their educational curriculum to some degree. There might be some national
Right.
standards. Whereas over the last 30 or 40 years, in many countries on both the right and the left, funnily enough, there's been this centralization of the curriculum. And you see it in universities, there's this homogenization of university
Right.
experience and so on. So this point of dehomogenization, the issue is it needs, funny enough, it needs a cultural commitment underneath it to allow this kind of diversity. And
It needs a desire for that diversity. So
yeah,
we were talking before about the world monoculture and regulation. So we do not have a world government.
yes,
We actually do have decentralized governance in our world, but we do have a shared culture that means governance is pretty much the same in lots of places. Again, COVID policies vary the same. Think about organ sales. There's one country in the world that allows organ sales in a very limited way, which is Iran. And bioethicists get together all the time and say, how are we going to make Iran stop being deviant and doing the immoral thing when the rest of us know the moral thing is not to allow moral organ sales? So basically, all countries but one are doing it the same way. And that's true through lots of areas of regulation. Most of medical experimentation is like that, nuclear regulation, airlines, banking regulation. Lots of large areas of policy in the world, including education, are done very similarly because we share a culture, even if we have separate governance. So the question is, how could we fragment the cultures?
yes, yes. And how, I mean, what I'm saying is why, my question, I guess, just to you was it could have this capitalist model, but you could have just other models
Right.
where there
But
was a
capitalists would fragment culture. That is, capitalists would, in fact, make a school that was different if they could just freely sell school to people, whoever wanted it. They would be willing to defy larger cultural convention
right.
in order to maybe make money if they could make a go of some new thing. That capitalism would be one force that would push for more variety against the pressure of a shared world culture. But that's
Right.
still limited. I mean, there are many things today capitalists aren't willing to do, even when they're allowed to do it, because the world culture says, no, we don't like that.
Right. Very, very interesting. And so, what I guess I've got a question that I want to come to is that there's this level of let's say this analogy of there's within species, there's the species, and then we could say like there's phyla, So one of the things we're very interested in at life itself and the second resource is really a question of like, well, there are these kind of large level kind of things of like being mammals versus fish. So there's this kind of really large scale, and then there's been, for example, modernity as this kind of almost base level culture. So, there's subcultures, the species within that, but there's this kind of general monoculture of like, okay, individualism is good, reason is good, secularism that have been spreading throughout the world and which seems almost universal. I mean, it is part of what you're describing as the monoculture. And that happened though, that isn't totally recent. I mean, if we go back 2,500 years, one of the things that seemed to interestingly happen is the actual age at a similar moment across multiple different like species, from northern India to, you know, Palestine, you had these kind of axial figures who were starting to say similar things. So that one of the questions, I guess, is like you've got these kind of base level. How does that support things? For example, there could be a monoculture that could come into existence in the world that valued its underlying agreement is to value cultural diversity or these things
Right.
like that. What do you think of? I mean, what I mean, what even to come back is underlying, like let's say yeah. So I guess I've got that question. Yeah.
I think you're pointing to the fact that it's hard to tell whether shared changes were adaptive or not. And plausibly, many of the big shared changes in the last few centuries were adaptive changes. They weren't just caused by randoming, they were caused by selection pressures. So, one of the things that happened that was more adaptive was that in culture, we like to copy success. And so, as different civilizations around the world and communities around the world started to see each other and perceive each other and judge relative success, they decided to copy the more successful ones. So, a big part of the spread of, say, Western culture in the world has been the rest of the world seeing it as successful and saying, we should copy success. And that is, on average, an adaptive process to copy success. The problem is, once the world copies success, we've got a single culture. That culture's changes over time are less plausibly going to be adaptive, but some of them will be adaptive, certainly. And the most plausibly adaptive ones are the ones that result from local selection pressures adding up to some net world change. So that's what a lot of business practice and technology evolution works, is because you have local selection to choose better business practice and better technology. And then, I mean, the whole world has Wi-Fi now, not because Wi-Fi is some imposed constraint, it's because Wi-Fi works well and people have adopted it because it works better for their local practices. And so I don't think Wi-Fi is a particularly maladaptive practice because it was primarily driven by local selection pressures. And many other common features around the world may well be the result of local selection pressures converging on the right answer. And that's what makes it hard here to judge what changes are being maladaptive. But this more abstract theory says there should be a lot of maladaptive changes we should worry about and we should be looking for them, but it doesn't say which ones they are.
So I want to ask one question at the end. You talked about one is with fertility is one of the things which is obviously maladaptive. What about ways where I mean, one question I guess it would be a provocative one maybe to you is in the way we're relating to technologies and including things like nuclear, which is both a technology we can be very useful and is also potentially dangerous. Similarly, there's discussions around AI and super intelligence. Is this one of these areas where there's a maladaptive, like there's a kind of mismatch, one could call a wisdom gap, a gap between the technology we create, or how we're managing climate change? What are examples of this maladaptation of our kind of culture to our the fitness landscape we are faced with?
I mean, for example, before nuclear energy was possible, futurists reasonably thought that would just make a huge difference to civilization. You could see how many things in society we use energy for and how limiting it is for many things we do that we don't have more energy. And they saw, wow, if you could get access to nuclear energy, that just opens up so many possibilities. You would just blow up ranges to make huge new seas in the middle of continents, go to other stars. You would have flying cars. It would just be all these things. It would just open up all this possibility. And they were right. In fact, we stopped increasing our energy uses about the time around 1970 when we decided not to go with nuclear energy whole hog. And plausibly, I mean, there's a trade off there. We could have also had big destructive consequences of nuclear energy had we done it badly. But I think on average, it looks like that was a mistake. It was a mistake to be so restrictive of nuclear energy, but it was a shared cultural norm. The whole world was scared of nuclear. The whole world decided nuclear was icky and scary. And so the whole
I'm
world
in
said, no,
agreement. That was a rational decision. I mean, it's a good example. I guess the question was but it's interesting because the connection, I think, of the reaction to nuclear energy on many levels was related to, for example, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was related to the other dual use. Nuclear is a dual use
sure,
technology, as is AI. AI
right.
presents all
And
this.
probably we would have had more nuclear bombs go off in anger.
Yes.
Maybe,
Or maybe
10 or
I'm not
20
even
would have
sure
gone off.
I'm not even sure that's even the case. It's just simply that there was a transfer of that
Right.
fear about the management of nuclear weapons. Because I guess my question is, what is maladaptive cultural behaviors in the context we have today? Like one, as you said, is popular, reduce fertility. The other you're saying is restricting technologies that could be useful. That
Right.
seems to
But
be this.
we have a big rise in mental illness, which seems rather puzzling. And so that seems more plausible. And drug deaths,
Yes.
both of those seem rather puzzling and plausibly the result of some cultural changes that have gone in the wrong direction. But you have to dig into those to figure out what. I'm not claiming I know
Yeah.
much detail
Yeah.
for those, but those are pretty plausible signs of something going wrong.
Great.
But that's just a large effort to do. But I was saying there were three levels, and I
Yes.
want to make sure we get to the highest level of abstraction
Yes.
solution because I think it's the most promising, even though it's also a long shot, big ask sort of
Yeah.
change. But it would be the one ring to rule them all solution, doing one thing that solves the problem if you could do it. So, a common approach to solving problems for at least the last century, increasingly, is to think, well, let's give the problem to government and tell them to solve it, right? I mean, people have often done that with many sorts of problems. They say, this is a problem. And somebody in the government says, okay, we'll solve it for you. And somebody runs for office on the basis, I will empower them to solve your problem. I will give them budget and they will deal with your problem. And the world has often bought that, right? We often did things to solve problems because government said, somebody said government could solve it. And then we empowered the government to do that. Now, on average, that hasn't gone that well. Governments often claim to solve problems, but then don't, or even make them worse. But it is a common instinct. And the major limitation there is really the competence of our forms of government. We have been tempted to give government more problems to solve because they've gotten more competent over time. Governments today are definitely more competent than they were centuries ago. And that's one of the major contributing factors to our empowering government to do more stuff because they are, in fact, more competent. Whether or not we're getting the estimate correctly of just how much more competent they are more competent now. But they're just not competent enough to solve many problems. And this, at the moment, does not look like the sort of problem they are competent enough to solve, even if you gave them a big budget and discretion. Our current forms of government do just not inspire confidence in me that they would just solve it if we said, okay, government, please solve the problem. But if we had a much more competent form of government, one where you would actually be able to give it a problem and then trust that it would actually solve it, then you would be giving it lots of problems, especially this one. I mean, this is how we solve many problems in our personal lives. There are many specialists in our world who are competent at solving kinds of problems, right? There's exterminators who will get rid of our bugs. There's dressmakers who will make a dress for us that looks nice on us, right? There's career advisors who will help us pick a career. There's all sorts of people around us. We solve problems by paying them to solve our problems because we think they're competent.
So how would we make government more competent, or our own methods of self-government? Yes.
Okay, so I happen to be the inventor of a form of government called futarchy. Is a
Yes, I
kind
was
of a
going to
name.
ask. Yes.
Okay. And it does seem to promise to be much more competent than our existing forms. Now, I proposed it 26 years ago now, and most of that time, people haven't tried it much. But in the last few years, we're getting a bunch of trials of this, and they seem to be going well. And of course, we need a lot more trials. So my proposal is that we continue to try this thing on larger and larger scales, confirming that it seems to be as competent as I claim. And then when it seems to be competent on a larger scale, we give it bigger tasks, including this one. So that's
But
just to be clear. I'm not proposing a radical
you're not
change all at
proposing
once.
it for everything. But describe futarchy.
So let's start with the example of a for-profit firm, a company, and the people involved with this company are going to agree they want to govern this thing to make money. So the metric of this company being successful is its stock price. It's a for-profit company. It's got a stock that you can invest in. And we want the price to be higher for this stock. That's the goal we want for this company. The employees and the managers and the investors all agree, yes, this is our lodestar. This is our goal. We want this company to make money. And the clear sign of that is it has a high stock price. All right. Now, imagine we've got a key decision. Probably the most important decision ever made about a company is whether to get rid of the current CEO and replace him with somebody else. It's a very consequential decision, and it's a very standard decision across companies. And so we want to ask which CEO, i.e., the current one or somebody else, which would be better for the stock price? We were willing to get rid of the CEO if we can be believed that the stock price would be higher with an alternative person. But if the stock price would be higher with the current guy, we want to keep them. It's in general what we want to do. But how can we get a good measure of the stock price given the CEO staying versus leaving? So maybe we pick the end of the quarter. If the CEO is out by the end of the quarter, we want to know what's our best estimate for the stock price in that case. And if CEO stays past the end of the quarter, we want to know what the best estimate for the stock price is there. How do we get those two numbers? If I could only get those two numbers, we can compare them and we can answer this question. But of course, we want good numbers, not just random numbers. We don't want to hire a consultant to hand us two numbers. We want good, reliable numbers. How can we get that? Well, we already have stock markets that estimate the value of the stock, and they do a good job. That is, if you see the stock price and you think it's too high or too low, you have incentives to go buy or sell in order to fix that price, move it closer to what you think, and make money on that. And we have a large literature that says financial market prices are good estimates of the numbers they're estimating, and it's hard to do better. Not impossible, but hard to do better. And this is whenever we've compared this mechanism to other mechanisms at the same time in the same place, asking the same question, access to the same people, the markets consistently do about as well or much better. That's just a consistent track record. So we have the stock market mechanism, and it's giving this unconditional number. It's saying, on average, how much is the company worth? And all we want is two conditional numbers. How hard could that be? Well, we have to make a conditional stock market. That's all we have to do to get a conditional stock price. What's a conditional stock market? It's a market where the trades are conditional. The trades will be called off if a condition isn't met. In an ordinary stock market, you trade stock for cash and you ask, in order to estimate the value of the company, you should think of all the scenarios the company could be in, and for each one say, okay, how much revenue will this company get in different future years if this scenario happens? And then you should average those all up to get your estimate of the value of the company. In these new conditional markets, you do the same thing, except you only look at scenarios consistent with the condition. Scenarios consistent with the condition that the CEO stays or the CEO leaves, and that will give you conditional stock prices, which is what you wanted to answer the question, should you keep the CEO? So now the mechanism is just, we make a conditional stock market for keeping the CEO, conditional stock market for not keeping the CEO. We compare the two prices, and then we choose which option to give based on which price is higher. And we have this large literature showing the power of speculative markets to make accurate estimates of things better than our other mechanisms we have. And we're just going to apply that power here to this decision. That's futarchy. It's a governance. Now, not only is this a powerful mechanism, it's robust against manipulation. So the first thing you're going to think of, oh yeah, but won't the CEO want to go manipulate these markets to make himself look like he should be kept? Well, of course he will. We're counting on it. But attempts to manipulate on average actually make prices more accurate. So these markets are surprisingly robust to manipulation, and they are powerful engines of aggregating information. And we could hand them problems like cultural drift.
And one question I just got is, who trades in these markets? Is it the stock?
Anybody who wants.
Anyone they want? And then the idea is these markets actually pay out in some way.
Yes.
They're not
So
just like, they're
right.
not,
So the stock market just pays out. You bought the stock or you bought the cash, right? Stock markets trade stock for cash.
yeah.
So the trades are just you get the stock or you get the cash. So that's
Just walk me
straightforward.
through for me here. I'm in this company. I'm one of the employees. I've got these two conditional markets of like what the stock price will be, and I can go and either buy the stock or sell the stock in one of
Right.
the two markets.
Right.
And what do I buy it with? My own money? And then I go and buy the stock with my own money, and then I get paid back based on what actually happens.
Let's be more specific. Say you got $100 and say the price of the
I'm trying to understand the payout here because
I'll
what does
walk
the
through it. I'll
market
walk you through
terminate?
it.
Yeah, yeah,
Walk you
okay.
through it. Okay. Say you think the CEO is crap.
Yeah.
You don't like the CEO. Okay. Now, there's the market in the stock price given the CEO. Say the current price is $20. Okay.
Yes.
Now, you could take this $20 and split it into $20 if the CEO stays and $20 if the CEO leaves. You take that.
$10. Ten.
Well, I'm
Right,
going to take the
$20.
$100 and
Yeah.
split it into $100 if the CEO stays and $100 if the CEO leaves.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the $100 if the CEO leaves, I can then buy 5 stocks if the CEO leaves
Yes.
because that's a conditional trade.
Yeah.
So I think the company's worth more if the CEO leaves. So I do that. I pay $100 if the CEO leaves for 5 stocks if the CEO leaves.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if the CEO stays, that trade is just lost. It never happened. Nothing. There's no change for me. But if the CEO
Yeah.
does leave, I had that trade. I got the 5 stocks. And now if the price goes up to 25 instead of 20, I made money. I made $25. I
Right.
bought at 100 for $20 each. If the price goes up to 25, now my 5 stocks are worth 125. I made $25 by
But it is in whether they leave or not, or in the value of the price of the company if they stay or not.
it's the price of the company if they stay or not that we're betting on.
Okay, that's what
And
I'm buying. That's what I'm buying. I got you. But how do I? Okay, so I can buy one side or I can buy the other side. I got
or you can sell the other side. You can buy or sell on either side. And what you're
right.
doing is then changing the price on either side. It represents our consensus estimate of the value of the company on either side. And you
And
get profit from that by moving the price better to its right answer.
and so how would this apply for governments? So what would futarchy look like?
Okay, so for government, we need to make a metric that summarizes what we care about. So for a company, it's relatively easy. We want to make more money with the company. But for a government, we need to say, well, what do we want for the government? Now, for the government, I mean, first of all, firms are governance. It's just that for the firm, we agree on what we want to govern
Yes.
on. We want to govern on making more money. Now, say you had a project to have a conference and you agree that you guys are going to try to have a conference. You have to decide where it's going to be, when, who you're going to invite, what the theme is, what the food's like. You have to make a bunch of decisions, right? But
Yeah.
what if you agree, well, what we want for this conference is for the most people to attend?
But that's easy to measure. But what about with things that aren't easy to measure? Like it increases our, our
Right.
reputation in the field. You have to find measurable proxies for these things, I guess.
Right. So for a company, if you think, well, the reputation will affect the stock price because people will think the company is not worth as much if it has a worse reputation, then the stock price is already including that problem. The same way for a conference, if you think doing something for the conference is going to make the reputation worth, then people won't come to the conference if it has a bad
No,
reputation.
no, but let's say for certain things, like I might care for my government, I might care about GDP, and I might care about like
Right. So the
being good
bigger,
citizens, something like
the
that.
more different things you care about as a group together, the more complicated your metric's going to be, but you still just add a bunch of things together. So
Right. Got you.
so say you take GDP, but there's already a literature among economists. You say you
Yeah.
study
Sure,
economists
sure. You
before
aggregate
of
it. Yeah.
aggregating other measures of welfare. So you could have measures
Got
of
it.
leisure, measures of the health of the
Yeah, yeah. I got
ecology.
I
You
got
could
it.
have measures of reputation. You just add a bunch of numbers together, and you get your best guess about what you care
But
about.
you
And
pick that as a society. So how
yes,
would that be picked as a society? Like, what's the process by which you pick this measure? Like,
right.
there's a
So
vote, whatever it is. But
right,
once
my
that's picked,
slogan is vote on values, bet on beliefs.
got you.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you'd keep having, say, a legislature.
yeah.
But now it doesn't pass bills on everything. It only passes bills to edit this national welfare metric. It decides, do we add trees? How much weight do trees get? How much weight does lifespan get? Its whole job now is to edit a current best guess of national welfare metric. And it passes bills that make those numbers higher or lower. And then at any one time, there's the current metric, and we pass bills according to that metric. We
And
decide
how
what policies.
and what kind of current experiments are you seeing happening around this? That you're saying like you're starting to see some experiments. There's prediction
Right.
markets, I guess, like things like
Well,
mana.
but there are more specific in that attesting this very idea of
Yeah.
decision conditional estimates. So, for example, there's something called the MetaDAO, which is a crypto firm that's been using this mechanism to make its major organizational decisions for a few years, and it's had maybe 15 or 20 decisions it's made using this mechanism. There are now some other crypto organizations using this to assign grants. There's actually an India-based government agency that's been using this to make health agency decisions, medical decisions about a medical agency and a government agency in India. I just read a post
So
this
we
morning about personal experiments and about other people trying to do funding experiments. So now there's maybe half a dozen experiments.
in the health agency in India. So what happens there? There's the metric of like life saved or
Or say
quality.
infant mortality would be one of the
Yeah,
metrics.
infant mortality. And then who are the people trading in the stock market?
Apparently, all the people who live in the area are trade. They gave everybody in the area an app on their phone where they could trade on these health policy decisions, and
Right.
hundreds of thousands of trades.
And then the basically what I'm trying to stand out is the payout is then based on, let's say I say, let's do this vaccination, and another group say don't. And then the stock was higher for like do the vaccination. So the
Right.
vaccination
Or
happened.
you might say
How does
infant
that
mortality is like if we're open on Saturday mornings, infant
yeah,
mortality will be lower, right? That's one of the
yeah,
policies. Should we be open on Saturday mornings, right?
yes.
And then you look at infant mortality conditional on being open Saturday, infant mortality conditional on not being open Saturday, and see which numbers lower.
And then, but how does the payoff relate to an actual result that happens in the world?
Because
What?
they actually measure the infant mortality. They actually have an informant and you can bet on it.
But you don't see, they either decide to open on Sunday or not, Saturday or not,
Right.
or run both conditions.
No, the whole point is you call off the bets on the things that don't happen. So that's what
Right.
happened with the CEO thing, right?
Right.
Remember?
So you call off the bets, and then how do you pay off? Because there's been a bet on how much infant mortality will decline.
You
So
only pay off on the thing that actually happens. So if you do
right,
open on Saturdays, you only pay off the bets about what happens if we open on Saturdays.
yes,
And then you have an actual infant mortality at the end of the year, and you actually pay off on that actual infant mortality conditional on the actual opening on Saturdays.
and the payoff is basically the closer you are to the actual number that happened, the more
Well,
money.
it's like with the stock price. If the number is 32 and you bought at 25, you make a profit. If you bought at 42 and the number is
Got
32,
you.
you lost.
Got you, got you. So yeah, got I really got you. So you want to be I got yeah, so that and the difference. Okay. Really got you. So the thing is people are rolling this out in places and it's
Right.
and we
Well,
could extend
so
it to
I,
government.
I- so I think you roughly understand. There's lots more questions, but I have to add one more thing to make this work. It doesn't work
Yeah,
yet to solve our
yeah,
problem, unfortunately.
yeah,
Okay. So the typical thing that would happen is we would set up these metrics about national welfare, and then
yeah.
say the market said, "Oh, we should invade Canada," and we go, "What? No, that doesn't sound right." And then we realize, "Oh, well, we didn't include something important in our metric," and we would go edit it or something. And then there'd be a feedback process between the decisions it would make and then our changing the metric to help us better realize what we want. But if that process is just too fluid and flexible, it doesn't solve our problem. We will
Yes,
just continue to drift culturally while having a metric that achieves what we want temporarily, but still becoming maladaptive.
yes.
What we instead need is to pick an outcome metric here that is inconsistent with civilization collapse. So it needs to be some long term goal that, in fact, wouldn't be achieved so easily if civilization falls. Like, when do 1 million people live in space? Or when do we have a colony around another star? Or when do we achieve physical immortality? These are all projects that might take several centuries. It would take a lot longer if civilization falls. So, if you give these goals to a futarchy, it will, in fact, have to ask itself, how do I prevent civilization collapse? Because that's a major obstacle to achieving this goal.
And why couldn't you just have avoiding civilizational collapse as the goal because it's too hackable? Because you
Well, you probably could, but the key problem is we don't actually feel very committed to it. So the key thing is we need to pick a goal, and then when sacrifices are asked in its name, we have to feel proud of that and more attached to it rather than less when sacrifices are asked. And that's what happens with sacred goals. So it needs to be a sacred goal, not just a nice to have goal, a deeply dedicated goal that we feel strongly about and that we are proud to sacrifice for.
so this is where
And
we get Earthseed and Octavia Butler coming in, like going to the
yeah,
start
right.
or
So
or
I just asked some polls about what could sit in this role, and the examples I gave were some of the top items. But unfortunately, the save ourselves from collapse just isn't a very strongly emotionally compelling goal for people in our world
right.
today. They are not very motivated to prevent it. So it doesn't work as a sacred goal that we would continue to pursue even when it asked costs of us,
Sacrifices of us.
sacrifices.
This is why, I mean, I should end on this point. We're getting close to time. Is the central role of religion. I mean, in life itself. And when we've talked about it, I mean, we see religion in a very broad sense, where in a way, even modern science has been a religion. But this importance of sacred goals and of a return of the sacred is really crucial. So it's fascinating to hear you say that. And it can be like in Octavia Butler's, Earthseed books, that going to the stars. It could be like that, or
Right,
it could be other things like all I myself actually as Zen Buddhist, all beings experience liberation, or every child
right.
live in a world where every
R-
child was
Right.
chosen, cared for,
But
and cherished.
unfortunately,
But
say liberation, we could achieve liberation without preventing collapse. So
well,
not all sacred goals work here. We need a goal that would actually be inconsistent with collapse. And
I,
that's why I gave you the ones
yeah,
I.
I see your point. Maybe we'd say all beings that we'd harm any animals in that world, but I got you that there's
Okay, but a collapsing civilization could just not harm animals too. If we're just going to prevent harm to animals, unfortunately, that doesn't prevent collapse.
is there any goal that we can think of that was less materialistic that would involve, or do you imagine?
Well,
I just think,
immortality, do you think that's materialistic?
well, physical immortality.
Yes, physical immortality.
I would say it's a materialistic one in that
Well,
yeah, I
it's
mean,
it's embodied in the world, but it's not,
embodied in the world.
it's
So
not
that's a good one. I mean,
collection of stuff. It's life and extending
yeah.
life, right?
No,
We
no, no.
could
I
we could
get it.
have not just long lives, but vital lives, active lives,
Yeah.
lives full of passion. Those
Yes,
being longer,
vital. I know. I hear you. I mean, a kind of flourishing. No, but it's a very beautiful point. I think just to end on. I mean, I don't want to leave you the last word, but this point that for futarchy or any system, but particularly futarchy work, we need a sacred goal of some kind that is related to the metric that we're really trying to do. If we're just trying to have the negative, we want something, whether it's going to our destination in the stars, whether it's
right?
physical immortality, but we need something that's kind of really deeply inspiring and touches us in a deep place to really
I
work.
mean, you're saying this as if it's obvious, but I find this surprising. I didn't expect this. I thought our world would just be comfortable not pursuing sacred goals and just living comfortable lives. That's what most people seem to want to do. And then it's surprising me to see it. No, in order to actually have civilization last, we need a sacred goal. Now, we do have to admit, this is still a big ask. That is,
Yeah.
first, there's a big ask of proving finding a competent form of governance, improving it, and adopting it. And then there's a big ask of targeting that toward a sacred long term goal that's inconsistent with collapse. So we're asking for several hard things there. But I still think this looks easier than the other things we talked about. The other
Yes.
two levels look harder to me, which
Yes.
basically means my default here is we fail. I have to admit that. My best
I
estimate
agree.
is we will fail, but let's try not to.
Let's try not to. It's true at life itself. We see collapse as a bit too likely. But the way I call this story is in Lord of the Rings, this classic moment where they're like, the best route is to go over the mountain. It's hard. Saruman is opposing us, but there's this hack. We'll go through the mount, we'll go through, and it's always
Yeah.
a disaster. Don't get tempted by hacks and do the hard thing. But I want to say thank you so much. This has been an incredible discussion. And, I feel this point at the end about sacredness is really important and quite profound. And it is true that we need something to take us beyond ourselves. I feel there's even a connection actually back to mental illness, that one of the diseases of modernity is we
Right.
lost sense of our sacredness, of what we're really committed to that was bigger than ourselves. Because the irony of all of this is that you sound like someone who's deeply committed to a good that
Right.
is beyond you and
Well,
your selfish interests.
humanity and our civilization is bigger than any one of us. It seems to me a grand cause to want to save civilization.
Yes.
I mean, many people don't feel that attached to it. I'm attached to that. But you have to be realistic and say, in order to save civilization, we will need to be more adaptive and we will have to pay costs for that. Adaptiveness is something we can't escape unless we somehow find a way to replace cultural evolution with some whole different process. And
Yeah.
in some sense, futurarchy is kind of like that. It's kind of a process that's going to govern culture and drive it to be adaptive. But either culture, our superpower continues to be the thing that drives us and pulls us forward, or something else is. And if culture is the thing that pulls us forward, we need to be adaptive. There's no escaping being adaptive if you want to have something that lasts into the future that represents what you value and pushes what you value in the future. You need that thing to be adaptive. And you have to make your peace with adaptation, even if social Darwinism shows you all sorts of terrible ways that adaptation might be pursued. Yes, but this is our superpower. This is what made us who we are. This is what gave you all the values you treasure.
Yes.
Cultural evolution is the thing that gave you everything you value.
And you're saying there are ways we can transcend it in its current, in its maybe in some forms, to become kind of self-conscious. Just as there was this move from biological evolution
Right.
to evolution, there's a moment of self
Well,
kind of
I mean,
transcendence.
futarchy is basic, very much in taking advantage of individual intelligence and consciousness and abilities to look forward and anticipate and be creative to find solutions to problems. That's what futarchy would recruit. And that would be a change from dumb natural selection. It would now be a forward looking process that tries to anticipate and prepare for problems.
Robin, thank you so much. Been great to have you on the show, and I look forward to talking more in the future. Thank you so much.
Be happy to talk again.